Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, honoured guests. Thank you for joining this Whitehouse Consultancy webinar. This is part of our human rights practice, not part of our fashion industry practice. We believe very much in promoting human rights, and that has a major, environment has a major role to play in that so far as we are concerned. And one great trend over the years is that clothing becomes increasingly affordable. We all now have several different outfits. We don't wear our shirts for a whole week or two, and that's great. But there is a price to pay for it. There's a price to pay in the human contribution to that in some of the sweatshops in China and elsewhere. There's a price to pay as we become ever more a throwaway society, whether we think that's right or not. It is the inevitable consequence of clothes being so cheap as they are in some regards today. We have a panel of 4 leading figures from the sector. Dr Lisa Cameron, the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Textiles and Fashion, will be joining us shortly. She's been delayed. It's a challenge of the policy field, I'm afraid, that members of Parliament often get delayed at the last minute. So she will join us as soon as she can. We have Dr Mark Sumner, a lecturer in fashion and sustainability at the University of Leeds. And as one who grew up in Bradford, just down the road, I get to send him a particularly warm welcome. We have Clare Lissaman, the sustainable fashion business expert, co-founder of Common Objectives and head of Oxfam's advisory service. And we have Paola Masperi, founder of the ethical fashion brand Mayamiko. I hope I pronounced that correctly for everyone. That is who is going to be leading us through the discussion today. I think Mark is going to kick off with some explanation of the value chains of the fashion brands that we deal with. There will be plenty of time, we hope, for questions at the end. If you have a question, stick it in the chat room, and hopefully my colleagues who are named but not seen on your screens will feed them through to us, and I can field them to our panelists. So Mark, would you like to kick off with a few minutes?
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for the opportunity to get involved in this discussion. It's a very complex area to be considering, but also a very vital one in terms of the scale of the fashion industry. And I always start off with these discussions talking about the fashion industry being an industry of industries. This is not just about one industry, but this is a global transboundary, national boundary industry of industries that has all sorts of challenges around ethics and environmental impacts. And that complexity is amplified by the fact that fashion is a cultural phenomenon. And what we're talking about here is we need to be able to pull on different levers within our culture to address some of these really big challenges that we face within the fashion industry, while at the same time still doing those really important jobs that fashion does. And fashion plays a really important role in culture and for individuals in terms of things like self-esteem and self-identity. Now, legislation is one of those levers that we can be thinking about pulling on in terms of trying to work out how we can navigate our way through this very complex and often very fluid supply chain that provides those garments that we all love to wear. Now, we know in terms of that legislation, what we need to be doing is making sure that we can get engagement with industry, but also making sure that that legislation has got some teeth. And it's this idea of having a progressive approach to legislation that is rewarding those that are engaging in good practices, but also making sure that those that are not compliant with the minimum standards, that there are some sort of consequences associated with that non-compliance. It needs to be an intelligent approach to legislation as well, because as I say, this is about culture, it's about transboundary, national boundary issues, where we are talking about maybe applying those morals and ethics that we have here in the UK, a set of values that we have in the UK, and applying those to different nation states. And it's important to recognise here, this is not about us saying our values are the right values and that's what everyone should be working to. It's about being involved in a dialogue where we avoid some of those colonial issues that we are very aware of from history, and in a way co-design the solution to some of these very, very challenging ethical issues through intelligent legislation. And really importantly, and some people may find this hard to believe, but industry, people in responsible brands have been saying to government and to policymakers, we need more legislation. And the reason that these responsible brands are calling out for this is because we do not have a level playing field. What we have is a situation where some brands engage in this process and in making really big investments in terms of delivering sort of ethical management within their supply chains, whereas other brands, big and small by the way, just don't engage in this process at all, and maybe are not even compliant with the existing laws around modern slavery. But because existing legislation doesn't have the teeth to change that, we've got that issue of an unlevel playing field. And what's really interesting in terms of COVID, so we're involved in a project at the moment looking at the impact of COVID on things like modern slavery in the extended international supply chain. What we've seen is where there are good, strong structures that are established to manage ethical compliance and ethical issues within the supply chain, what we're starting to see, and this research project is still ongoing, by the way, so we haven't got all of the data yet, but what we are starting to see is that those brands and those supply chains that have a good structure have tended to fare better in this COVID situation than those brands and those suppliers that don't have that structure to work on. So it's really important that we have improved structures within the supply chain to take into account these major macro issues like the pandemic, but also recognizing that there are other challenges out there. So I think ultimately what we've got here is the opportunity that we can do a lot more using the knowledge and expertise that we have already, but finding the way that legislation can work with other aspects of our culture to try and drive those changes within the industry to get much greater acceptance of this idea of having an ethical supply chain for fashion. So sorry, Chris, I've tried to keep that really small and short, so we've got plenty of time for questions.
Indeed. Standards are often a barrier to market entry, but in this sector, lack of standards can be a great advantage, perhaps. But Claire, would you like to say a few words? Remembering to turn your microphone on first.
You would have thought after a year of doing this, I'd have got the hang of how to not be muted on a call, wouldn't you? Thank you very much for inviting me to be here and be part of this panel today. I was asked to speak for 10 minutes on my experience of assisting fashion brands in this space, industry challenges, and how we created common objective. So I started, for 15 years, I worked independently as a consultant on what I broadly called ethical trade and fair trade in global supply chains, and helped launch Fair Trade Cotton back in 2004, which was really my entry into helping fashion brands. Sorry, there's a reason I'm telling you my history. And then sat on the board of the Ethical Fashion Forum for a long time, which then in turn spawned this creation of the Ethical Fashion Forum became Common Objective, and I'll explain a little more as to why. Sorry, my screen suddenly went very red. Can you all still hear me?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. As to how Common Objective came about from that. But I think what it means is I've basically been spending almost 20 years looking at this. And I think I remember 15, 20 years ago, very much knocking on doors and going, sustainability, it's really important. It will help your business. And we were all desperately, I don't know if you remember this, scrabbling around for the business case for why you should be sustainable or look at human rights. And then I looked at where we are now, particularly in the fashion industry, and it can feel really fantastic that sustainability is increasingly becoming a must-have rather than a nice-to-have. I'm seeing, I was looking at Elle the other day at the magazine online, and one of their main sections on their front page is sustainability. And whether we look at fashion brands, big or small, they tend to have quite prominently now their ethical trading policies or aspects. You can Google now organic or sustainable or eco when you're searching many of these fashion brands in a way that I think even 5 years ago we would have been surprised to see. So it can look as if we've had some really huge growth and positive change. I think for us, we held a business breakfast last year when you could still have, actually 2019 it must have been, when you could still have physical breakfasts. And there were buying directors came to this, and I was talking to one and she said, you know, normally I would have passed this on to our CSR department, to someone junior, maybe to a junior buyer. I would not have taken it myself as director of buying, but now I see it's relevant to my job. So that was an incredibly sort of positive change. However, just before I get on to talking a little bit more about my experiences, I think I'm a little bit dubious or cynical as to what has really changed without legislation. We've been reliant on voluntary initiatives, and that's at Co, you can look it up on our website. We have a list of over 100 different organizations, standards, and initiatives that have been set up to try and improve conditions in the fashion industry, and it's all voluntary, more or less all voluntary. We have obviously labor law and the Modern Slavery Act and things like that. So this was really exciting to me. I read in an ECCR report this year, Garment Supply Chains in Intensive Care, Human Rights Due Diligence in Times of Economic Crisis. I recommend you all read this report. But one of its recommendations was, when rebuilding more resilient supply chains, brands and retailers should ensure that suppliers pay workers living wages and social benefits. Thus, brands and retailers will need to rethink and change the current pricing model and underlying business model. So how fantastic is that to read in a report from this year? But I've been around quite a long time, and I remember reading this in a report from 2004, so almost 20 years ago. Until companies recognise that their own sourcing and purchasing practices are one of the root causes of poor labour standards, they will not resolve the problems in their supply chains. And that was from an Oxfam report, Trading Away Our Rights, in 2004. So, oh, my screen's changed again. This sense that sustainability is becoming a must-have is, I think, leading a little bit to greenwashing, potentially, with every brand scrabbling to try and sell their sustainability story. But also this sense that in 20 years, what have we really achieved? I feel a little bit like, what have I done? Have I actually done anything in my 15 years of working on this? And that's where I think legislation really plays a part. And hopefully I can see Mark nodding a little bit. Coming in there, that businesses, as you said, Mark, that the ones that are doing stuff are doing it, but that level playing field just doesn't exist, which means the whole sort of business model of how businesses work is still problematic. And a lot of my work and my experience to answer that question of what I've done has been helping businesses do what they can within the current environment, but that current environment is so price focused and profit focused for them over and above impact on environment and impact on people. I don't think I'm saying anything that you guys haven't thought of, to be honest. That it presents its own challenges, and the more we can have legislative or regulatory frameworks to support that, the better, or the easier it will be. That said, really the experiences I have when there are businesses that are trying to tackle some of this is they either want to jump in feet first and go, I've just read about oceans and microplastics and we've got to solve the problem and get rid of polyester from our supply chain. We must do that now. Or they're just completely overwhelmed and go, I don't really know where to start. And that really for me has been my experience with either businesses or individuals within businesses, large and small. And our experience, my experience in dealing with that is always to say, just take a step back, analyze really what you're doing, what your supply chain is. And for many, many businesses, they didn't know their supply chains. Look at what impact that has on people and planet, use the advice and support that's out there, and then create your own framework to start tackling issues that are within your remit to tackle one by one, and within the constraints that you have to tackle those. And they might be pricing constraints, market constraints, they might be product quality constraints that go, what can we do that's taking this step by step to these goals? And I find it really, really helpful with businesses. And I know from some quite major ones I've worked with, they said when you're a buying director, and you're coming into this new, that's kind of quite reassuring to go, we can just take this step back. We don't have to deliver everything all at once. I mean, it'd be good if they could. Don't get me wrong. So within one of the reasons we launched Common Objective from the sort of base of the Ethical Fashion Forum was to take ethical business out of the hands of just the people like Paola here and the people like me and the people that want to do it and have set up businesses specifically to grow things ethically, and say how that's not most of the fashion industry. How can we democratize that and make sustainable business be an incentive by being on the Common Objective platform? And I can talk more about the platform if we have some time later. I've skated over it, but you can look it up online. It's free to join. And part of that we've done is, if you're a paying member, you have to pay for this bit. We've given that framework, that toolkit to help you take that step back, to analyze, to look at your supply chains, to look at the different impacts, and to take businesses on a journey of where their starting point is and can come. And that came out of my experience, our experience of working one-on-one with businesses, but saying we need to democratize this and make it digital, and it enables a lot more people to access those tools. So that's one of the very practical things that Co delivers. The other one is it's a framework and tools and policies. They're all great, they're nice, right? You can put them on a shelf and forget about them. So we try not to do that and go, how practically can I actually do this? And so Co has, we're launching again this year our expo for buyers and suppliers to be able to meet and to really be able to source the materials and source the products and source the manufacturing that will enable this to happen. So to make it very practical. I think sometimes in our CSR world or ethical trading world, we can talk in theory quite a lot, and what Co tries to do is have that kind of systems process stuff, but also give you the practical tools to enable you to deliver it. So that's a very whistle-stop chat through assisting fashion brands, common industry challenges, and the creation of Co. I hope the organisers I've answered that. Just very, very quickly, you introduced me. I am now, as of today, it's my first day in this job, the head of Oxfam advisory service, which, unlike Co, which was digitising everything, I'm still on the board of Common Objective. Oxfam advisory service does very in-person work on human rights and gender specifically. And I think one of the things the fashion industry has done is it's grasped sustainability and environmental sustainability and is moving quite fast along those aspects. But the human side of it is perhaps in many businesses falling behind a bit. Labour rights, wages, working hours, all this stuff, I'm not sure has really progressed in the same way and been absorbed in the same way by the industry. So that's something that OAS is here to help with as well.
Great.
I think that's my 10 minutes, I think.
I think identifying those that there are a lot of challenges, and that companies that are already set in one way can only go one step at a time sometimes, but as long as it's towards the right destination,
absolutely,
every little helps. But Paola, if we could come to you, tell us how you did it in practice, how it works in practice with a brand that prides itself on these issues. Take it away.
Thank you. So yeah, sure. I guess my first point is that I want to acknowledge that none of this is easy. I mean, we live in a globalized world, and while it's so wonderfully open, it actually has created a lot of corners to hide and a lot of space for opacity. So none of this is easy. Even for a small brand like ours, things are not always as clear cut as we'd like them to be. So you really need to be quite determined and go and look and dig in those dark corners and not really be satisfied with the top level of information. For example, in our case, the opacity is more around the materials than people and production, because we control our own production. So we have a more holistic view of everything that's involved there, but less so when it comes to material. So just as a kind of as an intro point, this isn't easy work. This is hard work. So anyone that steps into it needs to be ready for a bit of a marathon and sort of stamina to push it through. So I guess for us as a brand, we started as a charity, as a women empowerment charity back in 2008. So for us, treating people and the planet as we'd like to be treated was really the core of why we existed. And although it doesn't sound like a long time ago, it was only in 2014 when we properly started as a brand, at the time, there was this weird split between, are you an ethical brand or are you a sustainable brand? And by ethical, we meant a brand that cared about people, about sustainable one that cared about the planet. But to me, that made no sense, because I could see, I guess, from time spent, well, in a country that is very focused on fashion like Italy, but also then working in the context of Africa, I could see that all of that was so heavily interconnected. So to me, that kind of differentiation made no sense. And so for my brand, I took a step back and I looked at all the regulations and the various voluntary charters and certifications that I could find. So the International Labour Organization, the Ethical Trading Initiative, various fair trade charters, Global Compact, and then actually with our team, to the point that was made earlier by Mark, actually co-designed a series of KPIs in sort of our own internal system, which was essentially how we wanted to measure ourselves and how we knew that we were doing things the right way. So we took a holistic view of well-being for our teams and for the environment that we worked in. And we knew, again, to Claire's point earlier, that some would take longer than others, and some we could get on with quite quickly and some others would come later. But we wanted to have a holistic picture to understand where everything's sat, and then we started tackling them one by one. So I guess if I look at it, we split things in 3 areas. So it's people, processes, and materials. So from a people point of view, I guess we train, develop, and create growth and creative opportunities for our teams. We encourage spin-offs, as well as we look at more holistic at well-being for people. So for example, are the kids of our employees able to go to school where they were not able before they joined us? So, it's much more than, are we paying the right wage? It's a lot more about, are they kind of being empowered to be productive and positive members of society for themselves and for their families? But also, do they sign up to the values? And actually, what are the values that make them proud? We defined our brand values collectively, and we have, I hope, a very open culture of dialogue and transparency, even when the news isn't so good, because, what you don't know, you can't measure and you can't fix. So that's from a people perspective. So from a process, I think we built responsibility and circularity from the design phase, but I will admit that we're not 100% there. I think if you look at circularity as a circle, we're probably 2/3 of the circle there. And we are currently working quite hard on the 3rd part of the circle, which is all about the extending the life of the garments after they've reached the consumers. So, we've sort of started to building these values in from the design stage, the production, and now, as I say, also looking at how we can sort of fully close that circle. But also this applies to marketing and the business model. 7 years ago when we started, before it was trendy, we chose to be season-free, and we chose to create longevity in our garments. So we chose not to chase trends. We also chose to go direct to consumer, because that meant that we could work with better margins for everyone involved in the supply chain. So we had a bit more money to spend on paying people and buying the right materials and redistributing them in our supply chain. And also we chose not to have a discount culture. So I guess that meant that as a brand, we probably haven't grown as fast and as exponentially as others, because we've put all those measures in place. But I think that growth that we've had has been, for us, more sustainable, and it's something that we can maintain and we can build upon. And actually, it really does consider everyone on our supply chain. So, it might not make us the biggest and the sort of most popular, but certainly it makes us sleep well at night. So that's really important. And then the 3rd area is materials. And like I was saying earlier, that's really the most opaque area for us. For some materials, for example, for organic cotton, we have visibility all the way from the seed to the finished garment. And so we really know the impact of every step of the supply chain. But there are other materials such as the organic, the locally sourced cotton that we use and the locally sourced textiles, where things aren't always so clear. And I think it's really important to be transparent with consumers about this and the why you're working in the way that you're working. For us, the initial position was we want to work with local women traders. We want to support them. We want to source locally. But we accepted that the trade-off there was that we didn't always have the full end-to-end view of where that fabric had come from. And so we knew that we were paying fairly and treating fairly the people in the supply chain that we knew and that we came in contact with, but we knew that there's an area of the supply chain that, you know, for us was a lot more opaque. So that's sort of those dark corners I was talking about earlier. So we have spent quite a lot of time trying to unpicking this, and we are getting somewhere. We're making progress, but it hasn't been easy. So I think it's important to know that, you know, these things are difficult and take time, and you can't fix them all at once, but you need to have a view of where the problems are so that you can go in and fix them. And then, so that's been a little bit about my experience running a brand that is responsible and is built around ethics and principles of ethics and sustainability. And then just a couple of finishing thoughts around the law and the regulatory framework. I was asked to talk a little bit about the power of consumer activism and consumer choices. And I guess my view, both as a brand and as a consumer, is that obviously consumer activism can move mountains, and we as consumers have huge power. But I feel like as consumers, our superpower comes out and gets activated when we are allowed to connect with the products and we stop seeing them as commodities. And really create that connection with the products that we buy. So they're not just something to be consumed and thrown away. They're actually something that someone somewhere, you know, grew and, you know, stitched and packaged. So that's when we have that connection with the product, and that's when we make different choices. And I can see that there's a lot of brands who are building this messaging into their communication, although, as Claire said, there's always a little bit the risk of greenwashing. But I feel that these conversations are all often left in the hands of activists as well. For example, we saw during COVID, large brands cancelling to the tune of $40 billion worth of orders with complete impunity while they kept selling, you know, online, and left essentially the makers and the producers sitting on all those orders and unable to pay salaries. Actually, that's an example where it was activism that brought the topic to the fore, and actually some brands have owned up to it. It wasn't regulation, it was activism that made that change happen. So I think great power in consumers, great power in activism, but I'm not sure that that's enough. And to be honest, I think the current legislation that we're talking about today, I'm not even sure that that's enough. It's definitely a great step in the right direction, but and for me, it's significant that the legislation puts accountability on companies for their actions, both at home and overseas. So it means that companies cannot just place the risk down the line by moving their production or their sourcing to other countries that might have a different legal framework. So I think that that's really important. And it's important that workers that are, you know, in tier 2, tier 3 can take legal action. But for me, the question is, are they empowered to do so? We see so many attempts to stop people from performing their right of association, being able to demonstrate. You know, last week there were news about this in Myanmar and in Turkey. So actually, for workers along the global supply chain to be able to benefit from this legal framework, I think the onus really needs to be on brands and on companies to demonstrate that they have a robust framework to assess, disclose, and remedy any human rights issues in their supply chain. So I think, you know, it's definitely an encouraging step in the right direction. But you know, we've all said, this isn't something that can be addressed by one single set of regulations. It takes stakeholders, it takes civil society, it takes representation from all sides and from all voices to come together. So I think that was just over 10 minutes.
No, no problem. It's interesting that you touched on origin and ethical cotton there, because as Dr. Cameron will tell you, I'm sure in more detail, it's just been announced that the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Dominic Raab, is to make a statement on human rights this afternoon. And some of us are hoping, no more than a hope at present, that it will include sanctions against the Chinese authorities responsible for the imprisonment and slave labor of the Uyghur community in China. But Lisa Cameron, welcome to our little show. As chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Textiles, there's been a common theme coming through from our three panelists so far, Lisa, that legislation and regulation is necessary, that the ethical brands, those who try to do right by their suppliers and workers, end up paying a higher price for that than the people who try and dodge what we would call basic standards of dignity in their workforce and environmental responsibility. How would you respond to that? How can your group take forward and be used as a platform for these issues to be heard in the political environment?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for Whitehouse Consultancy for having me along today, and to all of the previous speakers. I've been listening intently. I came from another meeting, and I've been able to hear many of you speak about the really crucial issues that must be addressed, and I think there's a broad consensus, as has been stated. So the All-Party Group for Textiles and Fashion started once again in Parliament in 2019, and you know, we had really felt that in the run up to Brexit, when we were working together, there wasn't much to be said about fashion in Parliament. It was almost as though the industry kind of looked after itself, whereas, you know, every other day we were speaking about the car industry and the impact of Brexit, the impact on the economy of various different issues, including COVID now, that fashion was and textiles were almost sort of left to the side for the industry to deal with, and not so much government involvement. But when we looked at the figures, they were really stark in terms of the amount of contribution to the economy, in terms of the level of jobs in retail, and in terms of the disproportionate number of women employed in the industry. So we felt that it was really important to restart the group, get it off the ground, and engage cross-party parliamentarians to take things forward. And part of that is about a real championing of British fashion, about fashion design, but also at the core of it, to really have those beliefs in sustainability and the ethics that should underpin such a well-respected UK industry worldwide. So since coming to chair the group again and working on some of those themes, there's been a lot of the adverse publicities we've seen in recent years regarding the garment trade, particularly in Leicester, hitting the news, and you know, there's been sort of consternation from the public as to what's actually happening in the UK in terms of manufacturing, but also in terms of the respectability of our British branding, which has really been held in the highest esteem throughout the world for such a long time. And it's certainly something that we want to champion cross-party in our group, to have those ethical foundations that will lead in a path ahead to make sure that that's the case, and that we take forward the very highest standards, and that people can rely on British branding moving forward. But as we know, in 2015, the University of Leicester research was published. 75 to 90% of garment workers in Leicester were paid grossly below the national minimum wage, didn't have employment contracts, and this was you know, subject to scrutiny, and many arbitrary work practices were found. The report had also estimated, interestingly, £50 million a year was being lost in underpaid wages in East Midlands alone. And if you think about that in terms of the impact upon those most vulnerable workers, that's horrendous, but also government tends to think in terms of the economy and tax return, and it's also hugely significant there. So on so many levels, much of the sustainability and ethical basis of fashion was then being questioned. So since this time and over the past year or so, we've been working really hard with the British Retail Consortium to link with ministers and to look at the possibility of a fit to trade licensing scheme for UK garment manufacturers to ensure that they meet their legal obligations with regards to employees, which we think is absolutely fundamental, but also in terms of health and safety and in terms of the reputation of our industry. So this type of scheme, which has garnered a lot of support across the retail sector from the BRC members, would be built upon existing licensing schemes such as those utilised by food and farming, requiring businesses to have a licence to operate, and there being checks on a regular basis to ensure compliance with legal standards. And I think if we were able to come together to work as one on these issues with industry, within Parliament and in terms of consumer input, then we would have the opportunity to make the UK world leading and innovative and very much export led, which is in line, I think, with government aims just now to be building back better and to really try to re-establish manufacturing across the UK. There is a huge opportunity to onshore, British made clothes by relying less on overseas sourcing, and to be able to try to build upon some of the issues that have been raised to establish an ethical manufacturing base, which would feed into the Global Britain agenda that the government is pursuing just now. So far we have a number of meetings arranged with the ministers who are involved, and I have to say it's still a bit of an uphill struggle in terms of the legislative base, but I think with the support of the BRC and with its members, it's certainly something that government are now listening to. And I had some oral questions in the House of Commons highlighting those issues as well. And part of our APPG is really to look at how we get the voice of industry heard much more frequently in Parliament, and therefore prioritised in terms of government agenda too. So the All-Party Group for Textile and Fashion will continue to make a really strong case for that in Parliament, and part of what we want to do when we get back to the House of Commons, hopefully later in the year, is also to have a space over this Parliament to showcase British design, to ensure that from every part of the UK that's something that we're able to highlight and to champion as parliamentarians for this industry. I'm also incidentally chair of the All-Party Group for Inclusive Entrepreneurship in Parliament, and I know that there are so many small businesses out there who are doing fantastic ethical work in textiles and fashion, and in so many other spheres, who have those at the helm who have many protected characteristics, but who also maybe come from minority backgrounds, and who want to have that sustainable, credible, transparent basis to the work that they are doing moving forward. We were so privileged to be able to attend one of the fashion summits prior to lockdown to look at some of the new textiles that are being configured out of, they were making shoes out of corn and recycled plastics from our oceans. Some of the designers were growing fabrics from mushrooms in their own their own businesses, and it was just absolutely illuminating how innovative and how technologically advanced these young people are, and how that really will be the future of industry. So what we want to do is really to combine the work through inclusive entrepreneurship, helping young designers, helping those with small businesses in industry to ensure that they have a sustainable base, but one that's supported by government. And the other strand of our work with the Textile and Fashion APPG has been that with the British Retail Consortium, trying to ensure that we take forward a fit to trade licensing scheme or something very similar to that, that would ensure reputationally that we can continue to say, you know, by British, that this is a high standard, this is something to aim for, this is leading in terms of world fashion, and it retains that eminence within the fashion scene. And as chair of both of the all-party groups, I'm determined to support small businesses, to support design, but also to support that agenda which ensures that the work we're doing fits with our climate change initiatives, fits with the leadership we must show in relation to COP26 as we reach Glasgow for this agenda this year, and that we grasp these opportunities with both hands and ensure a sustainable fashion industry moving forward within Britain, and also that we shore up our skills, our innovation, and our great talent in design to make sure that that's at the forefront moving ahead. So those are some of the themes we're working on, and we're always so very keen at the APPG to hear from others, to link with those who are at the forefront of the field to make this happen. So please, you know, get in contact with me, get in contact with the all-party group if you want to engage with us. And I'm really delighted to be here and to learn from others today as to what's happening in the front line, and also how we partner.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction to the work of the group. And I think all our speakers have raised similar points along the checking where it comes from, checking you're meeting the right standards. Consumers need to do the same, business owners need to do the same. But Mark, in practice, given the complexity of global supply chains and the real challenge of knowing where that cotton was picked, or where those plastic beads were formed to be melted down to make fabrics, how realistic is it? How effective can businesses really be?
It's a very difficult challenge, and I was involved in the 3-year project doing exactly that, and it's not easy or straightforward. And I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind when we're doing these sort of things is it requires trust and engagement from suppliers themselves to divulge and offer up data and information, not just about their own organisation, but also where they're getting their materials from. And that's quite a big challenge. Particularly a big challenge if, in reality, what tends to happen is if you divulge that information, you tend to find that you're getting yourself and your organisation potentially in trouble because you're declaring some things that have gone wrong. So there needs to be a change in the mindset in terms of how trust is created within the supply chain and with brands as well. I also think there's a very strong incentive for governments from different countries to also engage in this dialogue to try and work out how we can actually participate and get that sort of data that's been brought through. But I have to say, I've worked with people from different industries outside of fashion, you know, the food industry, the aeronautical industry, different industries altogether. And the common feedback when we explore each other's supply chains is the fashion industry supply chain is one of the most complex, it's one of the most global, and it is one of those that is so in such a high state of flux. It is constantly changing. And the thing that you know, is really challenging for brands and retailers, and I guess this is a really important point to make, is that brands and retailers do not own suppliers. They do not own supply chains. What they're doing is they're placing orders with a supply chain that without any of their control can change and move without any of their knowledge. So it's a real challenge around trust to be able to get that data and make that data work in a positive way, rather than it being treated as a way of beating up the supply chain yet again for something else that might have gone wrong.
Claire, anything you want to add on there, given your expertise in this area?
I think it's very dangerous to be billed as an expert on something in a room full of experts on, or people who do this stuff. I think, so that sort of following on from that, but also thinking about it, I think from my perspective, if people get it, I've never found a more professional term for this, but if people get it, they'll find a way to do it regardless of the challenges. And I suppose, Mark, when I listen to you sort of say retailers don't own supply chains, I'm like, well, they could. You know, we could have a situation where the retailer actually owned the factory. And I think we're beginning to see that. Again, but from the other way, we're seeing big factories set up retail brands of their own and market them globally. So we're beginning to see that supplier or manufacturer retail connection become closer again, perhaps. So I think sometimes we get stuck in a norm of behavior, that this is the way things are and they ever shall be. That's actually really quite recent. You know, it's what, 30, 40 years we've had this kind of globalization of our manufacturing in that way. So it doesn't have to always be like that. So I think that kind of mindset, where Mark mentioned, you know, a change in mindset as well, for me is one of the biggest barriers to change. You know, if people want to do it, they'll find a way. And I suppose the question as to how government or legislation can help change mindset, and then maybe change structures, to go to that ECCR report that I was talking about earlier, that the whole structures of business need to change in order for this to happen. Where does government fit in with that is quite an interesting area to explore. And I just was trying to think really quickly about it, but there's areas certainly around corporate law and what your responsibilities are as a business. You know, if it's only to your shareholders, if it's only about maximizing profit, we'll be talking about this for 20 years, that can change. You know, we don't have to do it like that. And we're seeing with the rise of B Corp, different models of structuring business coming up. And then there's the one, so I say this very, very glibly, that the mindsets will make it happen. I was talking to a factory owner recently in India, and he said, you know, he's got this mindset that he wants to have a great factory, but he's finding these little pinpoints that make it quite difficult to do. And a lot of that is about training and having the skills in the management of the factory and that lower level management, the supervisory level. So the owner might want to do something, but how do you make it play out in practice? And I think that's where the government, at least, can play a role in. And I think Lisa, this is what Lisa's talking about a bit, in how do we make British be bold again, be brave again, to use Trump language there, sorry. That sense of, can we support, can we provide training colleges, education, support, all this kind of stuff, so people have the skills and knowledge. And can the Indian government do that? Because at the moment, that's kind of, you know, when people want to do stuff but don't really have the tools for how to do it, that's a role. It's not so much legislation, but it's a role that I think government can play. So sorry, I don't think I actually answered your question there, but, you know, there were some thoughts.
I think what you've done is you wind it so that we're asking, what can government do to help? I mean, that's why we've got Lisa Cameron on, our political voice on the panel. One of our audience has posted something that follows on naturally from that. A question from Kamal, who points out that, yes, there is legislation and government can legislate, but there are other things that it can do. You touched on training and skills in the supply chain there, Claire. But Lisa, what about money? At the end of the day, it comes down to money. Other fiscal or other incentives that government could introduce to give a boost to the sustainable companies, because after all, as I pointed out earlier, it's the responsible companies that pay the price and the irresponsible ones get away with it. Just as we've encouraged wind farms, Kamal asks, by a subsidy in the early days, now making money, could we do the same in the fashion sector?
Yeah, absolutely. The discussions that we've had with ministers so far have been very much about, there needs to be a carrot as well as a stick in a sense for this to work. But also I think, so round about taxation, round about businesses who are seen to be doing the right thing, but there has to be some way of measuring that in a sense as well. And so there's been discussions, and I know the Environmental Audit Committee have done some reports looking at whether or not there could be a kind of traffic light system for consumers to make things more simple, but it seems that it's quite a complex industry and it can't be that simple. So those discussions are really ongoing so far.
Sorry, Chris, we can't hear you. You're still muted.
Sorry. Thank you for that. I was wondering, Paola, whether from your point of view, a fiscal step up would have been helpful in getting you up and running, or would it not have been part of your business planning at all? Would it have worked in practice? Would it work for other businesses?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously we all pay tax in the same way as probably, in sort of proportionally more than large business when you're a small business just getting started and you're sort of, getting your operations up and running and you're, making a first sale. So definitely some fiscal stimulus would have been really, really welcome. But I hear Dr. Cameron's point around, how do you measure it? How do you know that this company is worth rewarding or supporting versus another one? And again, I think we've got some great voluntary organization like the World Fair Trade Organization, Fair Trade, other sort of consortiums that the B Corp world that sort of really starting to create an ecosystem that can start to be recognized as something that is worth rewarding. And I suppose I also think from an investment perspective, a lot of financial investors still build their valuations around how quickly are you growing and how much are you selling, but actually shifting some of those values would really help, because if you judge me and my brand by how many pieces I shift, then you're probably not going to invest in me because you don't see the fast returns that you hope to see, were you to invest. But actually, if you start measuring other values, and I'm not talking about hippy-dippy tree-hugging values, but other core measures of well-being, of sort of, other ways of measuring value creation, circularity, how well can we recycle what's left from our supply chains and all kinds of other things, then the value of my business starts looking slightly different from what it looks now if you're just looking at purely financial measures, in terms of profit and volume and scale.
Okay, there's no sector much more focused on demographics, I think, than the clothing, the fashion sector, shoewear. We can break it down by age, we can break it down by gender, we can break it down by region of the country. Mark, is there any evidence out there that suggests genuinely that one group in society is emerging for whom these sorts of aspects of a product are much more important than they were historically? I mean, one always say, is there a youth quake on this one? Or is it more mature people with bigger budgets? Because a lot of this is price sensitive, although the amount people pay on trainers as young people always completely flummoxes me when you can still buy a cheap pair down the supermarket. But Mark, what's the evidence base that suggests change can be capitalized?
Well, before I answer that, Chris, I think Paola's made a really important point around how we measure success of business. And if it's all about volume sales and profit, then what you get is volume sales and profit. So I think there's something really integral to that point there that's really important. In terms of the evidence, in terms of the research, what the research tells us is demographic data is pretty useless at predicting who's going to be green and who's not going to be green. There's lots of evidence that tells us that Gen Z, for example, are very aware of sustainability. But in terms of people's attitude and in terms of their behaviour, There is no correlation. And what I mean by behavior is it's great if people are going to, you know, tweet about how important being green is. It's great if people talk about, you know, joining different campaigns. But if your actual behavior is you're still going to be driving as much as you did before, you're still going to be going out and buying as much as you did before, if you're not going to get full utilization of those clothes, if you end up throwing them in the bin rather than getting them recycled, the behavioural bit is the most important bit that we need to address here. And evidence upon evidence tells us that demographic data doesn't help us predict who's going to be green. So we need to find some other way of doing it. But I would also really strongly argue that for businesses in particular, there's no point focusing on demographic. This approach to sustainability is critical to the long-term success and sustainability of their own business, you know, in terms of economic sustainability. So there is enough evidence to say that businesses have to be green, whether their consumers are green or not. And this is where legislation could play an important role. You start tightening up these things and start challenging businesses across a level playing field, where we can start actually making it more progressive and more beneficial to be green, as opposed to not being green. So I don't think at this stage, Chris, that we can say that silver surfers are greener than your Gen Z, for example. It is very, very hit and miss on that. But I would very strongly argue that to focus on that from a business point of view is probably not a good thing in the short term.
Claire, a very quick word from you. It's behaviour as much as regulation and measurement. We've got to change the way we deal with our fashion. Mute.
Oh, I'm such a slow learner on the mute for us. Yes, I say that quite cautiously because I think it's easy to say, and we've got ourselves into a place where we see fashion as a market, we see fashion as disposable. And so to what extent we can put the onus on consumers to do all that changing. I think my colleagues at Labour Behind the Label and the Clean Clothes campaign are very clear that this change is not going to come from consumer behaviour. It comes from legislation. It comes from workers uniting to fight for their own rights, which I suppose is a behavioural change. I think that mindset behavioural change that I was talking about, though, that business doesn't have to be the way business is seen, which is what Mark and Paola have just said then about profit above all, is something that is a mindset change. So that for me is quite critical. So
Claire, thank you for that. I want to come for a final 30 seconds to Lisa Cameron. Dr. Cameron, how do you feel about the things that have been raised in this very interesting discussion? The role of government and politicians in particular.
Absolutely, and we have to have fashion and textile raised much more frequently in Parliament. It has to be more of a priority in terms of an agenda, rather than sort of letting the industry get on with it itself, which I think is what has tended to happen for many, many years. We have to show that leadership in the run up to COP26 and beyond. So I think this is a great opportunity and moment to merge the two and to, you know, link it with the Global Britain work that is being done to make sure that we show that leadership, and that I do think that consumers are interested. I think consumers, when they have the information at their fingertips, are interested. So I'm also very interested in the UK being leaders in innovation, so that, you know, we did as part of the group see some innovative work that's going on where you can put your phone onto barcodes on clothes and see the clothing's pathway from early manufacture, where all of the clothing has come from in terms of the textiles, who worked on it, where it was made, how much people were paid, the ethical journey of the garments. And I think young people are really interested in that kind of thing, and that will inform their decisions. So I think it's going to be a partnership between business, between consumers, and between government, and certainly the APPG will try to ensure that that continues.
Dr. Cameron, thank you very much. I think there is an important element there about marketing, and it's to tell a story about your brand, and technology makes that possible. The number of bus advertisements that go by with a QR code that you can either get a free gift or find out more about the tiger you've adopted. I think that flow of information hopefully will become more important and more valuable in future. But panelists, I cannot thank you enough. We will be repeating events like this on environmental and human rights themes We have a series on our website as we count down to COP26, and we have launched a human rights unit within the Whitehouse Consultancy to promote these issues. So do check out the Whitehouse website, which you can Google very easily. And I thank also not only our panelists for a fascinating discussion, but also the 30-odd in the audience who've come and gone during the course of this discussion, and of course the technical crew behind the scenes, my own staff, because as you noticed, I don't even know how to unmute. But thank you all very much, and as I've got used to saying, I'll see you in the next cartoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.